Alrighty, hello everyone and welcome to tonight's event. I'm Emma, I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library. We are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's event. I want to start off first by listing the next couple events for adults coming up at the library in a couple weeks. Next Thursday the 6th at 6 p.m. we're going to be hosting Pat Sullivan from the Museum of Maritime Pets right here in Rockland. And she's going to be doing a talk highlighting working maritime animals throughout history. It should be really fun. If you haven't gone to visit the museum yet, it's really cute. And then the week after that, on Tuesday the 11th, also at 6 p.m., we're going to be hosting Warren Kincaid, who is the Owl's Head Transportation Museum's ground vehicle conservator. Co-sponsored by Recharge Rockland. We're going to be learning about what electric cars looked like a century ago, so that should be a really fun one too. He's really fun. And for those of us joining on Zoom tonight, which I think is that camera, but might be that one, if you'd like to make sure that your cameras and microphones remain off throughout the talk, and then if you have any questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat as you think of them, and then we'll address them during the Q&A portion at the end of the talk. And then those of us joining in person, I have this little handheld microphone here, so when we get to the Q&A portion at the end, if you'd like to raise your hand, and I can run this over to you just to make sure that Zoom people can hear your question as well. And I think that that's it from me, so I'm going to turn it over to tonight's speaker. Margot Anne Kelley holds a PhD in American Literature and an MFA in Media and Performing Arts. She is the author of 2 books focused on people in relationship to the natural world, Local Treasures, Geocaching Across America, and a field guide to other people's trees. She taught at the college level for nearly 25 years, and since leaving academia, she has served as the editor of the Maine Review and co-founded a community development corporation that runs a food pantry and community garden, among other programs. So I'm happy to turn it over to Margaret. Go right ahead. Margot, sorry. Go right ahead. That's okay.
Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the genesis of the book, and then I'll read a little, and I would like to try to leave a bunch of time for having conversation. So the book, as you know, is called Foodtopia. It's about the 5 times in US history when large numbers of utopian idealists went back to the land to try and live out their ideas and ethics. And in each of the cases, well, let me take a step back. And these occurred in 1840s, in the 1890s, in the 1930s during the Depression, in the late 60s into the 70s, and then the most recent one began in the mid-2000 aughts and continued into the 20-teens. I was interested in finding out if they had anything in common, and if so, what they had in common. And that started because when I would go to farmers market, I noticed that there were people who were boomer generation and millennial generation, but not so much X generation among the vendors. And yeah, and that made me a little envious. I wondered why we got skipped over. That didn't quite seem fair. And I knew people who were millennials who were going back to the land. And I knew from my community people who were boomers who had gone back to the land during sort of the 1960s, 70s hippie heyday. And they had a lot in common, but not everything in common. And then as I began to learn a little bit more about them, those 2 cohorts, I discovered that they were also linked to those earlier cohorts that I mentioned. And in fact, you could make a very specific line connecting people and ideas from each of those moments to the next, so that what you start to get is a link, a chain of interpersonal connections, as well as beliefs and ideals and hopes. It began among secular folk. It began in the 1840s when the United States started to get urbanized. This is the moment when trains became something that was really effective as a mode of transportation, and a way to cut distances. It was the same moment that farms shifted from being predominantly about meeting community needs or individual family needs to beginning to work for exchange of goods for money. Before that, there was mostly just bartering, if even that. So it's the moment when the United States as we know it is beginning to go from predominantly rural to predominantly urban. And with that come a lot of problems. And the problems chiefly are about access to labor in an urban place where you can afford to have an okay life. So that by the time the next Back to the Millennium movement came around in the 1890s, people had discovered that life in the city was very good for the very 1% and not very good for nearly anyone else. An overwhelming 75 to 90% of people who lived in the city lived well below the poverty line. And so there was, again, a desire to move back to the country in order to live a more whole life, to be able to afford to feed yourself, to be able to afford to take care of your family, and to not get caught up in that system that was a system of tremendous deprivation. The reason for that big jump between 40s and 90s, of course, is the Civil War, which disrupted everything about United States culture. Then 1930s, there was another push. This time, the Depression was a big impetus for it. People, again, were struggling to feed themselves, struggling to live a good life. And so they began to think that if they were going to have to struggle anyway, it would be better to go to the countryside, work very hard, struggle in that regard, but be able to live a life with decent food and decent home options. One of the people who did that is a person well known here in Maine, and that's Scott Nearing. He and his partner moved from New York City to Vermont in the 1930s, and they lived there until 1952, when Vermont got too crowded. Yeah. So then his partner, Helen Nearing, dowsed over a map searching for a place where they should live next. And she knew she wanted a place near the water, and she found one on the Penobscot Bay here in Maine. So they moved up to Harborside, Maine, in Cape Rogier on the peninsula, the Bar Harbor Peninsula? Yes, Bar Harbor. And they lived there for the rest of their lives. Because they were there and because they were such well-known back to the landers, when people began to move to the country during the 60s and 70s, people made pilgrimages up to Harborside to see them, which I can barely even begin to imagine, because I know what it's like to drive those 90 miles now with really good roads and really reliable car. And people were doing it then, not just from here, but coming from all over the country to go and see them. And they were very generous with their time, their energy, their insights. They taught people, well, she taught people as much as they wanted to learn. He let people help him with whatever he was working on that day. But they directly influenced and inspired quite a few folks who have remained important in the organic food movement in the United States. Chief among them here in Maine is Eliot Coleman, who has been one of the great proselytizers in the last 40 years of organic methods, and has been also a tremendous resource for this most recent generation of Back to the Landers, who he routinely would bring on as interns and help train them so that they could learn the skills that aren't easy to learn in an agricultural setting, because so much of our agriculture in the US is big ag. It's industrialized, it's very much reliant on large machinery rather than on small and regenerative methods. So the folks who were going back to the land clearly were farming, trying to get their own food, which was, to me, the most surprising thing that they had in common. The other things they had in common were more typical of the things that you think of when you think of utopians. They all thought that freedom was the most important thing, and they all thought that living in the United States, people were having a harder and harder time attaining a sense of freedom. They all believed that equality was essential, and that the system, particularly capitalism, was undercutting all of our opportunities to have equality. They all also believed that the larger than human world was animate, and that we were part of it, and that we were imbricated into it rather than sort of operating above it, looking down at it and working it to our behalf. So they had these philosophical ideas, and those philosophical ideas on the best days, shaped their behavior, but even not on the best days, it shaped what their eating practices were. And so all of them not only were making their own food, growing their own food, or trying to live at a lighter level, they were all trying to think about a diet and a food ethic that was consistent with those ideals. Usually, that food ethic had something to do with not promoting inequality. So during the 1800s, not promoting inequality tended to manifest itself as not doing things that exploited slaves. And so people would avoid molasses and rice and other items that had been products of the slave trade. Into the late 1800s and the 1890s, it involved not exploiting laborers in urban practices and not eating contaminated food, because food contamination laws were terrifyingly lax. And so it was very easy to end up eating things that were contaminated, not only with unpleasant, like maybe slightly off products, but straight up poisons and toxins as well. I know, super gross, yeah. I won't read that part. In the 1930s, people were just simply struggling to live, in no small part. By the 1960s and 70s, race and gender issues had come to the fore again, because there were rights issues around farm labor. Farm laborers, as is still the case, don't have to be paid a fair wage. They were omitted when all of the acts that guaranteed fair wages and Social Security benefits and such were made. Farm laborers and domestic laborers were omitted from that process. So there were sort of activist outpourings in favor of farm worker rights. There were activist outpourings in favor of environmental justice, and in favor of making a system that was going to be generally more egalitarian. By the time we get to the youngest generation, the millennial generation of these farmers, what we see is that climate justice is the absolute #1 issue. It is interconnected to these other justice issues, particularly to issues around racial justice and economic justice, but it is the survival of the planet itself and our well-being on this planet that has come to the fore for many of them. So this is sort of the overarching argument of the book, is that these 5 generations are connected to each other. Their connection to each other has everything to do with their ideals and to food. And what they're trying to do in each moment is to respond to the most pressing challenges to justice and to a healthy planet that are present and obvious in the culture at those moments. So I look at them through 1 or 2 individuals in each of those moments, with the exception of the present. And as you pointed out, I have interviewed quite a few people for the present moment, and then a medium number of people for the 1960s, 70s. But for the 1840s, I look predominantly at 2 utopian experiments. The one that happened at Fruitlands in Harvard, Massachusetts, and the one that happened at Brook Farm in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. And the reason that I focus on those 2 is that they are 2 of the very first secular experiments in the United States. There had been lots of spiritually based experiments in utopian living here in the United States and elsewhere. And without any disrespect for those experiments, the limitation they posed for what I wanted to understand was that sectarian experiments, food rules are almost always predetermined. They're either predetermined by your sacred texts, or they're predetermined by an evangelical or ardent leader who is defining for you what those are going to be. I was interested in seeing what happened when people had to make those decisions collectively for themselves, and how that shaped how they thought about food and eating and their relationship to the land. So those are the 2 that I start with. And so for the purposes of reading a little bit to you right now, I'm going to read to you a little section about going to visit Fruitlands. 30 miles west of Boston, is this too loud or is it okay? Okay. 30 miles west of Boston in Harvard, Massachusetts, Prospect Hill Road follows the contour of the Nashua River Valley, providing beautiful views of fields and woodland below and Mount Wachusett beyond. From there, you can also see Fruitlands, once Amos Bronson Alcott's farm. The modest clapboard house has been well maintained of late. It's in far better shape now than it was when the hopeful farmers lived there. When they moved in, the kitchen was in a shambles, the chimney was unusable, and part of the roof had caved in. Now, the interior is clean and well appointed, and the exterior is a bold red that stands out nicely against both summer green and winter whites. Alcott had been inspired by Brook Farm, then 2 years old, though he didn't think the utopians there were quite ascetic enough. He envisioned creating a much leaner, more austere New Eden, where all beings could live in harmony with one another, fully self-sufficient and separate from the sullying influences of the larger world. Freed from the negative effects of capitalism and the increasing industrial culture, each resident would be able to access the divine within, and thus together they could establish a miniature paradise. Accompanying Bronson in creating this consociate family were his wife, their 4 daughters, Charles Lane and his son William, and a small changing group of acolytes. The core group moved to Fruitlands on an unseasonably chilly day, June 1st in 1843. A lot like this one. Given their desire to grow all their own food, they really should have had most of it planted by then, but only a few of them had experience tending anything bigger than a kitchen garden, and just one had any significant agricultural ability. That real farmer, a man named Joseph Palmer, was thwarted by the others. They refused to use manure to enrich the soil because they thought it would defile the soil's purity and because they thought it exploited the animals who produced the manure. Yeah. The destiny of not particularly good farmers trying to grow all their own food in not particularly good soil is not particularly surprising. Undernourished, with nothing to put by for winter, the group fell apart in less than a year. Had this been an ordinary farm, it would almost certainly have suffered the same fate as have most small farms in that area. The 90 acres of prime real estate would now be a suburban housing tract whose promoters tout the advantages of country life combined with easy access to the Mass Pike in Boston. Instead, despite its failure, the farmhouse and surrounding land have been preserved as a National Historic Landmark in honor of the utopian experiment. I grew up about 10 miles from Fruitlands and have visited the farm-turned-museum many times. One early memory is of a grade school class trip to see the place where Louisa May Alcott lived. Years later, when I was an English major in college, friends and I made the requisite Thoreauvian pilgrimage to Walden Pond and detoured to Harvard so I could show them where one of the other transcendentalists had lived. As far as I was concerned back then, Amos Bronson Alcott's claims to fame were that he was Louisa May's dad and a lesser-known transcendentalist. Recently, I returned to Fruitlands to find out more, to learn why he moved there in his quest for utopia, and to understand why it went so wrong so quickly. That visit took place on a sweltering August day, the heat index well over 100 degrees. The attic bedroom where the Alcott sister slept felt so dangerously claustrophobic that I left after a minute. Louisa May's weirdly enthusiastic diary entry from September 1st, "I love cold water!" suddenly made sense. The rooms below were marginally cooler. One is filled with the dusty old hardcover books to connote Alcott and Lane's impressive library. A bust of Socrates, a facsimile of the one that Alcott brought with him wherever he moved, now sits beside one of Alcott himself, a gently cleft chin and bushy eyebrows dominating his other features. A couch that belonged to Nathaniel Hawthorne and a writing desk used by Alcott's dear friend and acolyte, Henry David Thoreau, hold pride of place in other rooms. After letting us roam around the farmhouse on our own for a half hour, the docent at the museum called all the visitors to the kitchen for a Q&A session. We were a disparate group, an older couple from Florida, 3 women from Germany, a little boy, fidgety and clearly bored out of his mind, who must have been the son of one of the women, and me. The docent seemed proud of the Alcotts, impressed by their effort, and eager to tell us everything she knew. She grew visibly annoyed when I asked about Alcott's ineffectiveness as a farmer. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who tries to show up the tour guide, so I refrained from asking anything else. Happily, she soon moved on to something I'd been wondering about: why Alcott and Lane and so many of that era's other utopians were teetotalers. Earlier in the 19th century, Americans drank a lot of alcohol, and not just hard cider. According to the docent, by 1830, the average American drank more than 7 gallons of distilled liquor per year. I did the math when I got home, which is why I worry about being that guy. That's about 600 shots each. And to me, that didn't seem terrible. As most doctors say, a drink a day is fine. 600 shots is 1.6 shots a day. But their distilled liquor wasn't like most of what's available now. Corn-based and extremely potent, the only commercial product I know of that's comparable is Everclear. Yeah, which if you don't know Everclear, it's 190 proof grain alcohol, beloved by many a college fraternity, and banned in 14 states. As it happens, America's drinking problem was quite a bit worse than the docent's description suggested. The 7-gallon average she cited didn't take into account that children drank relatively little alcohol, and women imbibed much of theirs in the form of patent medicines, which enabled them to appear more restrained than they actually were. The American Temperance Society estimates that during the 1820s, the 3 million men in the United States collectively drank 60 million gallons of hard liquor each year, which averages out to 7 ounces of corn liquor per man per day, every single day, in addition to hard cider and beer. As the strength and quantity of the alcohol consumed increased, so too did dipsomania. State legislatures began restricting alcohol sales in 1838, making the 1840s a more abstemious period overall. Like Alcott, most of that era's other utopians were temperance allies who believed drinking alcohol interfered with maintaining physical and spiritual health. Alcott thought that alcohol, coffee, and tea all produced a false sense of mental stimulation, one that would obscure true awareness. Similarly, the Alcotts believed certain foods could enhance or detract from bodily and spiritual purity. After Bronson's cousin William Alcott, a physician, became convinced that vegetarianism was both healthier than a more varied diet and more spiritually pure, Bronson embraced this diet for himself, his wife and daughters, and all the other residents of Fruitlands. At just 10 years old, Louisa May saw avoiding meat as a moral issue with far-reaching implications. She wrote in her journal, quote here, "Without flesh diet, there could be no blood-shedding war," end quote. In 1850, William Alcott became one of the founders of the American Vegetarian Society, an organization that explicitly connected vegetarianism and purity. And another quote, "Vegetarianism unfolds the universal law of man's being. Its observance is a stepping stone to a higher order of existence. It removes obstruction, which hinders the fulfillment of man's highest aspirations, and it is the inlet to a new and holier life." Another of the society's founders, Sylvester Graham, also significantly influenced Fruitland's food regime. Graham's name is now mostly associated with the cracker he introduced. But in his day, he was a well-known crusader who sought to save humanity by promoting temperance. He urged abstaining from not only alcohol, but also meats, spices, fats, and white bread. All, he said, contributed to debauchery. The diet for which he believed God constructed man was comprised of raw fruits, vegetables, and bread made with unbolted flour. Moreover, Graham believed that if anyone, and here I'm quoting him, if anyone disregards these laws and by artificial means greatly departs from the natural adaptation of things, he inevitably brings evil on himself and on his posterity. I'm going to do one more paragraph. Regarding physical and moral well-being as intertwined led Graham to highlight hygiene too. He advocated bathing more, spending time outside, and exercising. And anticipating Dr. Strangelove by more than a century, he believed people should safeguard their precious bodily fluids. Having sex often was dangerous, he warned, as one lost a little bit of life force each time. His dietary plan, he assured his followers, would quell all their carnal passions. Avoiding meat and spices reduced sexual excitability, and consuming plenty of whole wheat bread suppressed the urge to masturbate. I personally am skeptical about several of these claims, but Graham's ideas were embraced by so many people in his day that his followers became known as Grahamites. And though I'm a little bit dubious about his assertion that omnivores bring evil onto their posterity, it is actually of a piece with claims made by many other utopians I discuss in this book, who also believed eating or avoiding certain foods comes with karmic consequences. Okay, so that's a little taste from the 1840s. And so I welcome questions about what I read, what I talked about at the beginning, your questions or your interests in food and food justice movements, or questions about writing. And if people on the Zoom want to weigh in at any point, I would happily take their questions as well. Tom, did you want to say something, or were you just guffawing?
I was guffawing about the Dr. Strangelove comment, but I also couldn't help notice that for some of the, shall we say, cockamamie ideas of Sylvester Graham, he's not far off from what's currently recommended for a whole foods diet, right?
No, he's not. He absolutely isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was curious, someone's gonna have to take the mic, someone take the mic away from me, because I'll just keep going. A couple of things I noticed. I was curious, the question I had was, did you notice a correlation in types of communication for each of these generations? Because I noticed that in the 60s and the 70s, there's the rise of television, and then we had the rise of the internet. Potentially the 30s could be the rise of radio, maybe the tide, I don't know. I'm curious about that. And this may be asking you to be a little William Gibson-ish, but do you see the next, where do you see the next wave coming, and what are the obstructions potentially to that?
All right, let me go back to communication first, because there absolutely is a correlation between, I wouldn't say not necessarily simply communications devices, but what Henry James called devices that annihilate space and time. So they are, isn't that beautiful? Yeah, so one instance of a technology that annihilates space-time is the train. Another is the automobile. Another is, you're right, radio. Each of the devices that allows us to have either one-to-many communication or to transcend the boundaries that somehow stultified communication in a preceding era. Yeah, so, but I do talk a lot about the fact that in all of these movements, except for the millennials, people lived together. They lived in collectives, in small aggregate settings. They may have had their own households. They may have lived in like huge, crazy dorms, but they all lived in proximity to one another because they needed to. It's only in the 2000s with the rise of the internet that is much less essential. You can have community that exists in on a Reddit AMA. I mean, you can have community in so many places that you couldn't have community before. We still do see among farmers today, no surprise, they aggregate because they aggregate around services and arable land. But the absolute requisite sense of having a community where people needed to live beside each other is less now than it was before, because they still have community whether they live beside each other or not. As to the next generation, I'll come back to that at the end if there's time, because that's a very vexed question.
Could you talk about the research that you did of today's group of people, how you found people, how you went about interviewing them, what you're finding out about what's different about them than and I remember the Back to the Landers back in the 60s and 70s, but what separates them, not unites them, but what are the separation ideas that have happened? It seems like they're more, I would say they're less utopian in some ways and more entrepreneurial.
Yeah. No, that gets at perhaps the most important difference, besides the fact that they don't need to live beside each other. Each of the other movements saw entirely exiting capitalism as essential. They saw that the power of capitalism as so profoundly corrupting that if they wanted to live a good life, they had to do it from the outside. Now, to be 100% honest, that was in word rather than deed quite often, particularly in the 60s, 70s, but it was the word, that it is what they professed. This generation does not do that. There are utopians who live separately, but those aren't the folks that I'm talking about, and they tend to be in communities that are not organized around farming per se, although they may have like a central plot that they all do as a collective garden. This group has B2B corporations. They do triple bottom line accounting methods. They do keeping the food local. They try to make their supply chains local. They're much more interested in like what I think of as capitalism light, which is what a co-op is. Co-op is capitalism light. Like you're making a financial exchange of goods for services. There is an intermediary. However, capital doesn't accrue. If you're in a co-op, then at the end, all of the members of the co-op vote what to do with the money, whether it's to like each take a dividend or to put it back into a building fund for the roof, whatever. But it's not accruing the way it does in true capitalism. And so the millennial farmers are in that same spirit. And you can see that in the fact that like in triple bottom line accounting, the three of those lines are people, planet, and product. People, planet, product? I think that's what it is, yeah. So their commitment is to pay themselves and all their employees a decent wage. It's to make a product that is the highest quality product that it can be, and it's to make sure, and on the first one with the money and people part, they try to make sure that they're not only making a product that the most well-off people in their community can have, but they're trying to make a product, they don't always succeed, but they're trying to make a product that's more widely available. And then their methods for growing that product are almost always regenerative. Even if they're not like certified organic, they're organic adjacent. And often they're not certified organic because the cost of becoming certified organic, if you have a farm that's less than 10 acres, is sort of like the cost benefit analysis is fairly prohibitive.
How did you find them?
I started with two farmers whom I had met at the Farnsworth. I emceed a panel at the Farnsworth of farmers who were working at the intersection of agriculture and farming. And then I told two friends, and they told two friends, and they told two friends. And I had a student who had become a pig farmer. And so I talked to him and his friends. And so once I'd had like, I don't know, 30 or 40 interviews, enough that I felt like I had a sense of like, what are the issues out there and how do I engage this more effectively? I went to the Stone Barns Conference for Young Farmers, which was a conference that was held in person every year prior to the pandemic. And farmers could apply, and there were so many more farmers who applied than could go, that they were selected by lottery. So they were farmers from all over the country. And I was able to talk to farmers from the West Coast, farmers from Chicago, farmers from South Carolina, like a much more diverse array. At that conference, I met somebody who had trained with Elliot Coleman, but was now, and then her partner worked with Alice Waters and for Slow Food, and now they have a farm in North Carolina. And so I wanted to follow them and use them as one of the through lines in the book. So then I went down and I met them in North Carolina at their farm. But one of the things I will say about all these farmers is that, with one exception in that entire millennial cohort, they were awesome humans. They were warm and friendly and gave time, more time than they probably really could because they're so busy. But they were really, really willing to talk about the issues. And when I went to Stone Barns, it was the year after they'd had a very ugly racial skirmish happen at the conference. And so that year they were like doubling down, tripling down on trying to really think about racial justice and equity issues. And so I was able to interview many more farmers of color than I might have had a chance to interview otherwise. Yeah. Yes, sir.
These communities, I'm sorry, thank you very much. These communities are self-consciously deviant
Yes.
as they separate themselves from the larger society, and there are costs to doing that. What resistance did they create against their work, and what spillover was there where the larger community could see value in some of their practices and behaviors?
I'll start with the agricultural community and then maybe we can go from there, but I think that's a good place to start. So as I said, most of them are regenerative or organic adjacent. I had a chance to interview some dairy farmers. Dairying is not an easy field to, well, it's not an easy field to make a living, period, but it's really hard if you're organic. The margins are crazy slim, and for those of you who haven't been mired in all of this stuff for the last few years, you don't get to set your prices if you're a dairyist. The milk prices are set by the federal government, which means that if you have a conventional herd, and they're mostly in a confined setting, you get paid the same number of cents per gallon milk as if you have a beautiful herd out on the landscape and you're feeding them the really good stuff. So dairyists tend to aggregate because of the kind of land that they need and the size of land that they need. The couple of dairyists that I met, when they first started farming, they butted their heads with their neighbor who was a conventional farmer. Over time, they have acknowledged that they are learning as much from him as maybe they are hoping that they're teaching him. So the things that bind them together around the problems of dairy, the problems of living in community, transcend, at least in some instances, the things that push them apart. I would say, however, that the challenges between local, regional production models and industrial and national and international production models are, at least as far as I can see, pretty intransigent. I don't see ways that those are going to be easily overcome by either side. If you have ideas, I'd welcome them, but it just seems to me that the models are so kind of, everything that they are having as their bench points for success are so different that I don't know how they're going to ever have a rapprochement. Does that make any sense? Yeah. I'm only standing here in case of Zoom, so.
That's okay.
Yeah.
How has the book changed you?
Oh, what a lovely question. Thank you for asking that. I think it made me face my inner nerd. I loved this research. You can tell, I have a million quotes. I had 450 footnotes before my publisher got his hands on the book. So it made me recognize that. It makes me eat more consciously. And one of the things I will say is when one, at least when this one, spends that much time learning about food and food systems, there's no going back. And like, you can't unknow the gross things that people put in canned foods. Not all canned foods, but like just representative canned foods. You can't just say, oh yeah, I'm gonna eat X or Y, even though I know that all of the molecule bonds have been broken by the process of turning it from what it used to be into what it is now. Yeah, so it changed me in terms of having that toward the front. It also made me acknowledge that my garden, much as I love it, is just a toy. The folks who are doing this for real, even the ones who are doing like an acre, that's hardcore compared to what I'm doing. And I had felt pretty proud of myself before all of this. So I don't know what else, but probably more. Yeah. Yeah, Jacob.
Thank you. You mentioned it briefly, or alluded to it briefly, but can you talk more on race in the context of the 60s Back to the Land movement, particularly, I guess I think of in the context of people moving out of urban centers where a lot of racial justice work was happening to engage in what, on the surface at least, might seem like different kinds of struggles.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. One is, for those of you who aren't familiar with her, Fannie Lou Hamer was a hugely important voice in farm justice, farm worker justice, and she created an enclave that was meant to be one of the first rural African-American communes that was agrarian. So she's an important touchstone for this conversation. Another one, ironically, perhaps ironically, is the Black Panther movement. The Black Panthers did so much to bring to the fore the idea that eating healthy food is a social and political survival strategy. And after the diggers who were out in California and they were serving free food at Haight-Ashbury, after they kind of waned, and at the same moment, the Black Panthers were starting their free breakfasts in Oakland, and they were helping to garner support around that. And they pretty much, I won't say single-handedly, but they had an outsized influence on the United States developing a free breakfast program in the schools. And it's not usually like you're smirking, but it's not usually sort of, I don't think ever publicly acknowledged by the USDA, but it was their influence that helped propel that movement toward having a free food movement in the schools. They did not do too much in terms of agrarianism, although they did promote it, but they did have what were called conspiracies, and in the good sense of the word conspiracy, not the contemporary sense of the word conspiracy. And conspiracies were basically buying clubs. And so people would get together and they would aggregate their financial resources, and then they would buy wholesale so that they could afford more for the same number of dollars. And so the Black Panthers helped to promote that in California as well. And so there are these things that are around the edges that urban African Americans were doing, and then there were some things that rural African Americans were doing. Rural African Americans had been, this is an interesting and super horrible fact. In 1920, that was the height of rural Black land ownership. And then through many, many machinations, most of which are really super underhanded, the land was taken away from them through like challenging inheritance practices, through different kinds of requirements inside their specific municipality, so that now the number of farmers who are on the land who are African American is lower than it was in 1920. It's starting to get better because of these millennials, but it's a long way to go because of all that level of disenfranchisement. Yeah.
Thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. I guess, to your other thing, Sandy, is it was a good opportunity to take the 30,000-foot view and take the 100-foot view. And so now I can kind of see the links between that a little bit better than I might have otherwise. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. This is fantastic. Thanks, Margot.